It's late on Christmas night in Boulder, Colorado. The Ramsey house is quiet for the first time all day. Wrapping paper is stuffed into trash bags, the tree is still lit in the front window, and a 6-year-old girl who spent the evening showing off her new bicycle is carried upstairs, half asleep and tucked into bed. By sunrise, that same house will be full of police officers, friends, and family, all moving through a crime scene that nobody quite realizes is a crime scene yet. A 3-page ransom note will sit on the staircase, warning the parents not to call the police. And somewhere in the basement of that big, comfortable home, the body of JonBenét Ramsey will still be inside the house everyone's searching. Before we go any further, a quick warning. This story involves the murder of a child. I'll avoid graphic detail, but the facts themselves are heavy. If that's something you're not in the headspace for right now, please take care of yourself and maybe come back another time. For everyone staying with me, tonight we're going to walk, step by step, through one of the most infamous cold cases in American history. We're going to humanize this little girl beyond the pageant photos, look closely at that bizarre ransom note, talk about the mistakes that were made in those first crucial hours, and go through the major theories that people still argue about today. And in the end, we'll talk about why, nearly 3 decades later, no one has ever been convicted of killing JonBenét Ramsey, despite DNA, grand juries, documentaries, and a level of public attention that almost no other case gets. Let's start by meeting the child at the center of all this. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was born on August 6, 1990, in Atlanta, Georgia. By the time she was 6, the family had moved to Boulder, Colorado, an affluent college town at the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Her name, JonBenét, is a combination of her father's first and middle names, John Bennett. That detail tells you a lot about how wanted and cherished she was in that family. She wasn't just the daughter. Her name literally carried her dad's. Publicly, most of what we see of JonBenét are the pageant photos, big curls, heavy makeup, sequined outfits that made a lot of Americans deeply uncomfortable once the case hit the news. But people who knew her described something much simpler. A 6-year-old who loved Christmas lights, dressing up, singing, and being the center of attention in the way a lot of little kids do when adults laugh and clap at their performances. She was learning to read. She liked to help decorate the house, and she had a big brother she alternated between annoying and adoring. Her father, John Ramsey, was a successful businessman. He ran a computer services company called Access Graphics, which had just crossed a big financial milestone. Around the time of the murder, he'd received a year-end bonus of $118,000, a very specific number that you'll want to remember, because it's going to show up again in a way that feels almost too on the nose for fiction. Her mother, Patsy Ramsey, was a former beauty queen herself, Miss West Virginia in the 1970s. She was very social, very involved in the local community and church, and very proud of her kids. She was also a cancer survivor, which is important context when we talk about how some people judged her behavior later. This was a woman who had stared down her own mortality, recovered, and seemed determined to live as brightly and publicly as possible. And then there was Burke, JonBenét's 9-year-old brother. He was a quiet kid by most accounts, more interested in computers and video games than in the spotlight. He will go on to be one of the most talked about figures in this case, despite never being charged with anything. For now, in December of 1996, he's just a 4th grader on Christmas break, excited about presents and holiday trips. The Ramseys lived at 755 15th Street, a large, somewhat maze-like house in Boulder. It had multiple levels, staircases, and a basement that included a small, windowless storage room sometimes called the wine cellar. It was the kind of house where it was easy to lose track of where everyone was, even on a normal day. On a chaotic one, that layout would matter a lot. Christmas of 1996 was supposed to be busy but normal. The family had plans to fly out the morning after Christmas to meet John's older children in Michigan and celebrate a second holiday together. On December 25th, they spent the day at home, opening gifts, and that evening they went over to family friends, the Whites, for a Christmas dinner. According to the general timeline, they left that gathering sometime around 8:30 to 9:30 p.m. and drove the short distance back home through the winter cold. Here's the version the Ramseys have always told. JonBenét fell asleep in the car on the way back. When they arrived home, John carried her upstairs, still asleep, and tucked her into bed in her pink-themed bedroom. Burke went to his room. The parents finished up for the night and went to bed themselves. No screaming, no fight, no indication that something catastrophic was about to happen. And then we jump to the early hours of December 26th. Around 5:30 a.m., Patsy Ramsey wakes up. The plan is to get everyone to the airport for that flight to Michigan, so she throws on the same clothes she'd worn the night before, an odd detail people will later fixate on, and heads down the back staircase toward the kitchen to make coffee. On the way down, she sees something on one of the wooden steps. It's several sheets of paper, written on in pen, laid out on the staircase. As she starts to read, she realizes it's a ransom note. It begins with a strange line. "Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully." It claims to be from a small foreign faction. It says they've kidnapped JonBenét and are demanding a ransom of, here's that number again, $118,000. It's written in an oddly dramatic, almost movie-like style, with phrases people later pointed out seem pulled from action films. And unlike most ransom notes, it isn't short. It runs about 2.5, almost 3 pages. Just imagine that moment for a second. It's still dark. The Christmas decorations are still up. You're walking down the stairs thinking about coffee and airports, and suddenly you're holding a rambling ransom note with your daughter's name in it. Patsy panics. She calls out for John. The official story is that she reads enough to understand that someone claims to have JonBenét, and then she immediately calls 911, despite the note explicitly telling them not to involve the police. On the 911 recording, you can hear the stress in her voice as she tells the operator that her daughter has been kidnapped, that there's a ransom note, that they need help right away. The call ends, but there's been decades of debate about those last few seconds. Some audio analysts claim that you can hear other voices in the background, possibly John, possibly Burke. There's argument over whether Patsy hangs up or sets the phone down. The official investigators concluded there was no clear, reliable extra conversation there, but the idea that someone else was talking in the background became one of many hooks for people suspicious of the family. What we know for sure is this: by about 5:52 a.m., police are dispatched to the house. Friends, neighbors, and even the family's pastor are also called and begin heading over. That right there is the first big problem. In a perfect world, when there's a possible kidnapping, police arrive, secure the house, limit who comes in and out, and treat the scene as potentially critical evidence. In this case, Boulder was a relatively small department that had never handled a case like this, and everyone, including police, initially believed the crime had happened somewhere else. The note said JonBenét had been taken. There was no obvious sign of a struggle in her bedroom. There didn't appear to be an active threat inside the house. So instead of locking down the scene, the front door might as well have had a revolving door installed. Friends and family came over. People sat in the kitchen, made coffee, cleaned up dishes, moved around the house. An officer did a quick sweep, but didn't find anything obviously wrong beyond the note and the missing child. Crime scene tape never went up in a serious way. For hours, the Ramseys' home was less a lockdown crime scene and more a chaotic gathering spot filled with terrified people. Meanwhile, attention is focused on that ransom note. The note instructed John to gather $118,000, oddly specific, almost exactly equal to his recent bonus, and wait for a call from the kidnappers later that morning with instructions. It said not to call the police, not to talk to anyone, and threatened that if he disobeyed, they would behead his daughter. It was written in strangely personal language for strangers who supposedly didn't want to get caught. They referred to him as a fat cat. They referenced his business. It was wordy, theatrical, and full of spelling and grammar that some people saw as intentionally clumsy. Almost immediately, law enforcement and FBI consultants thought the note was weird. Real kidnappers don't usually hang out in the house long enough to write a multi-page letter. They certainly don't do it with the family's own pen and paper, which is what later forensic work suggested. Pages torn from Patsy's personal notepad, a pen from the Ramsey home, and even what appeared to be a practice draft of the note found in that same pad. If the crime had been committed by an intruder, that intruder had come into the house, stayed long enough to quietly write a long letter, and then left the notepad and pen neatly behind. It didn't look like a professional kidnapping. It looked like staging. But if it was staging, staging by who? As the morning dragged on with no call from the kidnappers, the anxiety inside the house must have been suffocating. Around 10 a.m., Detective Linda Arndt, who was left alone in the house with the Ramseys for a while, would later say she felt outnumbered and uneasy. She eventually suggested that John and a friend, Fleet White, do another top-to-bottom check of the house, starting at the basement, looking for anything unusual. They go down the stairs into the basement. There's a broken window that John later admits he'd broken earlier himself to get into the house after locking himself out, which is one of those little details that will fuel intruder theories for years. There are storage areas, a train room, a general clutter of family life. And then there's that small, windowless room, the one some people call the wine cellar. John opens the door. He sees his daughter on the floor. She's lying on her back. There is tape on her mouth. A cord is around her neck tied to a makeshift garrote fashioned from a piece of nylon cord and the broken handle of one of Patsy's paintbrushes. Her hands are bound. The scene is horrifying, and John does what almost any parent would do in a blind panic. He picks her up and carries her upstairs, taking her body out of the room where she was found. From the point of view of a grieving father, that's an instinctive act. From the point of view of forensic science, it's catastrophic. The position of the body is changed. The cord is shifted. Fibers are moved. The room, which might have been a contained crime scene, is suddenly flooded with people. Patsy throws herself on her daughter. Friends hover nearby. The paramedics who arrive attempt to determine if there's any chance she's still alive, even though rigor mortis has clearly set in. The coroner will later determine that JonBenét died from asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. In plain English, she was strangled and had a massive skull fracture. There was no semen found, but there were injuries and evidence of an acute sexual assault and possibly previous irritation in the vaginal area. Her genital area appeared to have been wiped. The cord around her neck was tightened with that broken paintbrush handle, part of which was later found back upstairs among Patsy's art supplies. The bottom section of the brush, though, was never found. Inside the house, there are other odd details. A bowl of pineapple with milk sits on the kitchen table. On the bowl and on the spoon, investigators later find the fingerprints of Patsy and Burke. The autopsy shows that JonBenét had pineapple in her stomach that looked only partially digested, suggesting she'd eaten it not long before she died, likely after they got home from the Whites' party. But in their interviews, both John and Patsy say they don't remember giving her pineapple that night. It's a small detail, but in a case this murky, small details get magnified. If their memory is wrong, that's one thing. If they're lying, that's another. And if JonBenét was awake and eating after the family got home, then the simple, carried straight from the car to bed story isn't quite accurate. By the time JonBenét's body is found, this is no longer a kidnapping. It's a homicide in the basement of the family home. And in the eyes of a lot of people in that house, and soon the entire country, there are three obvious potential suspects. The only three people known to have been inside that home all night: John, Patsy, and 9-year-old Burke. To understand how the investigation unfolded, you have to understand how law enforcement works in the United States. In a serious case like this, you've got the local police department, in this case Boulder PD, who are first on scene and handle the basic investigation. But you also have the county district attorney's office, which decides whether to charge anyone and what charges to bring. Those two entities need to work together. If they don't, you can end up with competing theories, withheld evidence, political pressure, and ultimately no trial. From almost the beginning, Boulder PD leaned toward the theory that someone in the Ramsey family was responsible. The elaborate ransom note, the lack of any obvious signs of forced entry, the staging of the body in a room inside the house. This didn't look like a stranger abduction gone wrong. They put what they later called an umbrella of suspicion over the parents. The district attorney's side, however, especially after they brought in an experienced homicide detective named Lou Smith, was more open to the idea of an intruder. Smith pointed to the broken basement window, a scuff mark on the wall, what looked like a footprint on a suitcase near that window, and the presence of unknown male DNA found in JonBenét's underwear and on her leggings. He argued that the garrote, the possible stun gun marks that some analysts believed they saw, and the sexual assault pointed more toward a sadistic intruder than panicked staging by parents in the middle of the night. So now, instead of one clear direction, you have two narratives running in parallel. The family did it and staged a kidnapping narrative, and the intruder slipped in and out of a big, busy house narrative. Both sides saw the same evidence through different lenses. And to make matters worse, the crime scene had been so heavily contaminated, by friends, by family, by officers walking around, by the body being moved, that some of the most crucial questions might never be answerable with certainty. The ransom note became one of the central battlegrounds in those early years. Handwriting experts pored over it, comparing it to samples from Patsy, John, and others. Some said the evidence strongly suggested it was written by someone trying to disguise their handwriting, and that Patsy could not be completely ruled out. Others said it was inconclusive, and that Patsy's samples were significantly different. No consensus was strong enough to stand up in court as this person wrote this note. But stylistically, most observers agreed. This was not a normal ransom note. Real kidnappers generally keep things simple to reduce their time and exposure. They use phone calls, not 3-page manifestos left on stairs. And the fact that the note demanded not a round number like $100,000 or $150,000, but specifically $118,000, the exact amount of John's recent bonus, made it almost certain that whoever wrote it knew the family's finances intimately. We get another major forensic puzzle in the form of DNA. In the late 1990s, DNA testing was nowhere near as advanced as it is today. Still, technicians were able to find a partial profile of an unknown male on the underwear JonBenét was wearing and, in some tests, on the waistband of her long johns. As the years went on, additional touch DNA testing, trying to pull genetic material from tiny skin cells left behind when someone handles fabric, seemed to reinforce the idea of an unidentified third party. In 2008, more than a decade after the murder, the Boulder district attorney at the time, Mary Lacey, sent a letter to John Ramsey formally apologizing for how his family had been treated and publicly declaring that, in her view, the DNA evidence now cleared the Ramsey family of involvement. From that point on, at least officially, they were no longer considered suspects. But plenty of people in law enforcement and in the public weren't convinced. Some argued that the DNA could be contamination from the clothing manufacturer or the store, or from first responders at the scene. Others pointed out that a partial profile, without a clear match, doesn't necessarily prove that a family member didn't touch the clothing too. So we're left in this frustrating middle ground. The DNA is suggestive, but not definitive. The ransom note is bizarre, but not conclusively tied to any one person. The crime scene is rich with detail and yet, because of how it was handled, hopelessly muddled. While all of this is unfolding behind the scenes, something else is happening in public, the creation of a true crime media phenomenon. From the moment the ransom note and the pageant photos hit the airwaves, the American press went into a kind of frenzy. This case had everything the 24-hour news cycle of the late 90s was built to devour. A wealthy family, a murdered child, beauty pageants, a mysterious note, accusations flying in both directions, and a police department that seemed to be in over its head. Talk shows, tabloids, and news magazines all hosted segments debating whether the parents acted right on camera. Every smile, every piece of clothing, every hesitation in an interview was analyzed and reanalyzed as if the solution to a homicide could be found in whether someone looked sad enough. For many people watching from a distance, a narrative formed quickly. Wealthy, image-obsessed parents, a heavily made-up child in pageants, a city that didn't quite know how to handle rich outsiders, and a whiff of something rotten behind the country club facade. That's the power and danger of first impressions and confirmation bias. Once people decided this seems wrong, every new fact got filtered through that belief. Behind closed doors, the legal system moved slowly. A grand jury was convened in Boulder in 1998. In the American system, a grand jury doesn't decide guilt or innocence. It decides whether there is probable cause to charge someone and send a case to trial. The proceedings are secret. Witnesses are called, evidence is presented, and at the end, the district attorney decides whether to sign whatever indictment the jurors vote on. In October 1999, the DA, Alex Hunter, held a press conference. He announced that the grand jury had completed its work and that he did not believe there was enough evidence to bring charges against anyone. For years, people assumed that meant the jury had declined to indict. It wasn't until 2013, almost 14 years later, that unsealed documents revealed the truth. The grand jury had actually voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey on charges related to child abuse resulting in death. Hunter simply chose not to sign those indictments, citing his belief that he couldn't prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt in a public trial. Legally, that was his call to make. Politically and emotionally, it was explosive. To some, it proved that the parents were guilty and had been protected. To others, it showed that the evidence was always shaky and that sending a family to trial on a case that week would have been reckless. Life for the Ramseys did not return to anything like normal. Patsy spent the next decade battling both public suspicion and a recurrence of cancer. She died in 2006, still insisting she had nothing to do with JonBenét's death. Burke, The brother, who had been a child when all of this happened, grew up under a cloud of strangers whispering that maybe he'd done something terrible and his parents had covered it up. In 2016, a CBS docuseries titled The Case of JonBenét Ramsey put forward one of the most popular family involvement theories, that Burke, as a 9-year-old, may have hit his sister in anger or frustration, possibly over that bowl of pineapple, and that the parents, discovering this, panicked and staged a kidnapping to protect their son, inadvertently creating the horrific scene we know today. In this version, the head injury comes first, and the strangulation is part of the staging to make it look like a sexual predator attacked her. The show's experts walked through the layout of the house, recreated the sound of a flashlight blow on a skull using a pig carcass, and implied that Burke's behavior in old interviews was suspicious. They stopped just short of saying he did it, but the message landed. Burke sued CBS for $750 million, claiming defamation. A few years later, the case quietly settled. Here's where it's important to separate what's emotionally satisfying from what's legally and factually solid. Could a 9-year-old have struck his sister in a way that caused a fatal skull fracture? Yes, in theory. Kids are smaller, but so are their siblings. Accidents can be catastrophic. Could parents, in a moment of absolute terror, make panicked, irrational decisions that end up looking like calculated staging? Also yes. Human beings under extreme stress are not rational. That doesn't excuse crime, but it does explain why some parts of this case can look almost too theatrical to be real. But here's what we don't have. We don't have any direct evidence that Burke attacked his sister. We don't have a confession, we don't have a witness, and we don't have forensic proof tying him to the wounds. We don't have a clear, step-by-step sequence of events inside that house that night. We have suspicious details, contradictions, and a lot of hindsight. So while it's okay to explore theories, it's also important to remember that under the law, Burke is not a suspect. He was a child in that house, and he has never been charged with anything related to this case. On the other side of the theory divide is the intruder narrative. Lou Smith, the detective who became something like the patron saint of the intruder theory, spent years cataloging every piece of evidence he believed pointed away from the family. The broken basement window. The suitcase under that window that might have been used as a step. A possible footprint in that room. The unknown male DNA. The idea that a sexual predator might have fixated on a well-known child whose pageant photos were publicly visible long before the internet made such things commonplace. In his view, the garrote, a fairly complex device for a panicked parent to invent in the middle of the night, suggested a perpetrator with a specific, disturbing sexual fantasy. He and others pointed to cases of intruders slipping into homes during holidays when people's routines are more chaotic and their guard is down. Over the years, police have considered a number of potential intruder suspects. In 2006, a man named John Mark Carr confessed to being there when JonBenét died, saying it was an accident. His story fell apart quickly. His DNA didn't match, his timeline didn't hold up, and it became clear he was chasing a twisted sort of fame. He was never charged in the case. There was also a local man named Gary Oliva, a convicted sex offender who had expressed disturbing interest in children and had photos of JonBenét. But again, no DNA match, no direct evidence tying him to the crime. Other names surfaced in the press over the years: electricians, drifters, people with vague connections to the area or the family, but none resulted in charges. This is where the case becomes almost like a psychological mirror. If you go into it believing that parents are the most statistically likely perpetrators in child homicides, you can cherry-pick details that point to them. If you go in believing that law enforcement railroaded an innocent family because of their biases and early mistakes, you can build a story around an intruder who slipped through the cracks. The truth is that both sides have evidence on their side, and both have problems. For the family did it theory, you have to explain why no definitive forensic evidence ever tied them to the act of killing or staging. You have to believe they were capable of calmly writing a lengthy ransom note in their own home, in their own handwriting, knowing their daughter was dead downstairs, rather than, say, calling 911 in a blind panic and admitting something terrible had happened. For the intruder theory, you have to believe that someone unknown entered the house, stayed long enough to either assault and kill a child or wait for her to come downstairs, wrote a long note in language that just happened to echo the father's finances and movies popular at the time, and then left without being seen by any neighbors or leaving obvious forensic traces beyond some ambiguous DNA. On top of all that, You've got the simple, brutal reality that the first day of this investigation was so mishandled that key questions may never be answerable. People walked through the house. They cleaned the kitchen. They moved the body. The basement wasn't sealed off. Every step away from best practices was a step away from clarity. So why is this case still unsolved? Part of the answer is those early mistakes. When the first hours and days of a homicide investigation are messy, the odds of a clean resolution drop dramatically. Part of it is the split between Boulder police and the district attorney's office. When your investigators and your prosecutors don't agree on who probably did it, it's very hard to build a case strong enough to present to 12 jurors and say, "We are sure, beyond a reasonable doubt, that this is the person." Part of it is the nature of the evidence itself. The ransom note is strange but ambiguous. The DNA is powerful but incomplete. The injuries can be interpreted in different sequences. Did the head blow come first or the strangulation? Was the sexual assault part of the killing or part of the staging? Honest experts disagree on those questions even today. And part of it is time. Witnesses' memories fade. Investigators retire or pass away. Physical evidence degrades. In late 2025, the death of former DA Alex Hunter, who chose not to sign those grand jury indictments back in 1999, was another reminder that the number of people with first-hand knowledge of those early decisions is shrinking. Despite all that, this isn't a dead case. The Boulder Police Department still gives annual updates. They say they've processed hundreds of pieces of evidence and collected dozens of DNA samples over the years. They insist they are working with outside labs and federal partners to take advantage of the latest forensic techniques. They push back hard against critics who say they're sitting on untested evidence, insisting that any viable samples have been examined multiple times. At the same time, JonBenét's father, John Ramsey, continues to be one of the loudest voices demanding more. He's met with current police leadership and with experts in genetic genealogy, the same kind of technology that has helped solve other cold cases by building family trees from tiny amounts of DNA. He has publicly said he believes there's a real chance, more than 50-50, that with the right testing, the killer could still be identified, even after all these years. One particularly frustrating detail that's come out in recent coverage is that the DNA found in JonBenét's underwear has not yet been run through full-scale forensic genealogy methods. There are technical and legal reasons for that, questions about how strong the sample is, privacy concerns about the databases involved, and the sheer cost and complexity of the work. But for a lot of people, it feels like an obvious step that should have been taken long ago. In 2024, a Netflix docuseries called Cold Case, Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey, brought the case back into the international spotlight yet again. The series highlighted alleged investigative missteps and argued strongly that the family had been unfairly painted as suspects. In the wake of that show, Boulder police reported receiving over 100 new tips, enough that they moved up their usual year-end public update by a month. They say they're working through those leads slowly. Another thread giving some people hope is the work of the late Detective Lou Smit. Before he died, Smit created a detailed spreadsheet cataloging every piece of evidence he believed pointed to an intruder. Some reports suggest that modern cold case teams are using that spreadsheet, combined with improved DNA analysis, to methodically narrow down potential suspects. Whether that work will ever result in an arrest is still an open question. Meanwhile, the case continues to live this strange double life. Inside the world of forensics and law, where standards of evidence are high and time is running out, and inside the world of true crime, where podcasts, YouTube videos, and documentaries can explore every theory under the sun without those burdens. There are even totally baseless conspiracy theories that have nothing to do with evidence at all, like the bizarre internet rumor that pop singer Katy Perry is actually JonBenét Ramsey grown up, which ignores the simple math that Perry is older than JonBenet would be. That kind of thing shows just how far public fascination with this case has drifted from the reality of a murdered child and a grieving family. So where does that leave us? On one level, it's tempting to treat the JonBenet case like a puzzle box we can solve if we just stare at it long enough. Rearrange the timeline, re-examine the photos, reinterpret the body language in an old interview. We like stories with clear villains, neat motives, and justice served in the final act. But real life doesn't always cooperate. Sometimes the truth is messy, or partly lost, or split between imperfect human beings who saw different pieces and came to different conclusions. Sometimes the person who did something monstrous dies before they're ever identified. Sometimes the system fails in ways you can't fix later. What we do know, without any theories or speculation, is this. A 6-year-old girl named JonBenét went to bed one night 2 days after Christmas and never woke up. Someone strangled her. Someone fractured her skull. Someone tied a homemade garrote around her neck. Someone wrote or staged that ransom note. And that someone has never stood in front of a judge to answer for it. We also know that the people closest to her, her parents, now one deceased and one still speaking out, and her brother, who has tried to live a private life, have spent almost 3 decades under a microscope, judged by strangers who were not there. Maybe you believe one of them is hiding something terrible. Maybe you believe they were victims of both a killer and a broken investigation. Either way, it's worth remembering that accusing real people of murder based on gut feelings and internet theories carries its own kind of damage. As for whether this case can still be solved, we're living in a moment when DNA technology is changing what's possible. Investigators have solved rapes and homicides from the 70s and 80s by pulling new information out of old evidence, building family trees from a few partial markers, and following those branches down to a front door. There's no guarantee that JonBenét's case is solvable, but there's also no guarantee that it isn't. If you've watched or listened this far, I'm curious where you land, carefully and respectfully. Do you think the most likely answer is inside the family, that something tragic happened that night, and everything after was a cover-up that spun out of control? Do you lean toward an intruder, a predator who slipped in through a basement window and was gone before anyone knew what had happened? Or do you think the truth is something we haven't quite articulated yet, something stuck between those two poles? Whatever your theory, try to hold 2 things at once: curiosity and compassion. It's okay to analyze the ransom note, to talk about the pineapple, to debate grand jury decisions and DNA profiles. That's part of how we as a society process unsolved cases. But it's also okay to step back and say, at the center of all this speculation is a real child whose life ended violently, and a family whose Christmas turned into a permanent open wound. If you'd like to see more deep dive breakdowns like this, where we go beyond the headlines, walk through cases step by step, and try to balance the detective mode with empathy, feel free to stick around, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you think about the JonBenét Ramsey case. Which theory makes the most sense to you, and what detail won't let you go? Just remember, we're not the jury. We're not the detectives. We're people trying to make sense of something senseless, almost 30 years later. And until someone is charged and convicted, the murder of JonBenét Ramsey remains exactly what it has always been, a heartbreaking mystery at the center of America's most infamous cold case.